Well, let's switch over and talk a little bit about this orphan train photograph, which is
Okay.
one of many misconceptions about the orphan train. You've mentioned a couple, and this photograph is one of those common misconceptions. Yeah.
There we are.
All right.
And I
So,
go ahead.
for many years, this picture has been associated with the orphan train, kind of erroneously. It seems like it kind of came about by accident. I talked to the Kansas State Historical Society and one of their curators, and he said that this is one of those cases where somebody really helpful is going through a museum collection and they go, oh, I think this could be something, and they write their thoughts down, and somehow it becomes part of the museum's record. And that's what happened with this image. He said it came to them from the Santa Fe Railroad, gave them a big collection of photographs. And then a researcher was looked at and said, oh, I've heard about this thing called orphan trains. Maybe this is one of those.
Mhm.
Wrote it down, and that's how it kind of became associated with the orphan train. Nobody ever verified it or fact checked it. And so for years, people have been using this image thinking that it's an orphan train. It's on books. It's in, movies. It's even in our museum because when we first opened, we thought it was an orphan train too. So it is all over. But John, you've done a bunch of work kind of looking into what this train might actually be. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this train and what it might be instead of an orphan train.
Okay. Well, again, this was one of the pieces that enticed us to get involved um, with the Orphan Train saga. And like you, when I tracked down the source of it, I called the Kansas Historical Society, talked to um, their photo archivist, and she sent me the caption, which says that this may be an orphan train. Doesn't say it is, maybe. Well,
Right,
people obviously jumped on that.
right.
And I think, again, that rose out of the notion that there were orphan trains that traversed the country dropping kids off. And we know that is not the case, that they all rode on regularly scheduled trains. So if we look at this, and I consulted at length with people at the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe um, Facebook group.
Mhm.
Um, and if you look at this photograph, um, this is not a passenger train at all.
Right.
And what this probably is, well, 99.99% sure of what it is. When railroads are building lines back in the day, this is probably dates to about 1870, 1880, somewhere in there. Um, Trains that they were building to a new town. It was called what was called the head of track. In other words, as track layers laid track, a train would pull forward slowly on the new track. Um, and this is probably, well, not probably, this is a head of track or one thereafter work train. This train has arrived in a new community, and all the people from the local area, or many of them, are having their picture taken with the first train in town.
I imagine it was a pretty big deal to have one of these kind of track trains because getting a railroad going through your town was going to be like a huge boost to your local economy, right?
It was absolutely one of the most important things that happened then by say 1875, when you got a train coming into your community. And like I mentioned earlier, there was one in and one out, so to speak. Um, you had access to the US mail because the mail traveled by rail, as they say. So that was, and many other things. I mean, just goods and services, the cost of things went way down, travel time was slashed, etc. So let's take a look at what we've got here.
Okay.
We have a steam locomotive. We have a tender with the number 384 on it. And that's one of the ways you know this is a Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe train. Now, the tender, people usually think, well, that's where the coal or wood is at. And that's true. The tender hauls the coal or wood, but it hauls something that's even more significant, and that's water. Steam engines use copious amounts of water, which on a regular intercity run would require the train to stop at least every 80 or 90 miles, not for fuel, but for water. So keeping that in mind, look at the next car back behind the tender. It's a monstrous barrel, right? Got that?
Yeah, nice and round.
Right. Yes, it is. And that is a water barrel.
Gotcha.
That was filled with water because on this line, in this location, there was no water tower available to water the locomotive and the tender. So that's how we know that this is a sort of out there in the wilds train that's carrying its own water supply.
Right.
And that water supply would add about 90 miles to the train's travel length. Next car back is a box car. And if you look very closely at it, again, you'll see the Santa Fe symbol. That was probably a tool car. So as the men were laying track, and that was all done by hand, this is where their hammers, sledgehammers would be kept, all the tools that they needed, etc. Plus probably some spike equipment and connector equipment. The next car back is also something that was never on a regular passenger train from the railroad's inception through now. That's a cook car. You can see the chimney coming up off the top of it.
Oh, yeah.
That is a cook car. And for track laying teams, they obviously didn't go to the local restaurant when they were 10 miles out in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So food was served, prepared and served right to the crew. And of course, food on the railroad construction crews was like food on any of those. Food was very important in terms of keeping men on the job and women on the job. So the quality of the food and the amount of food was key to keeping a crew together that could function well. The final car, and in this photograph is a good one because there are reversions and reprints of this photograph that cut off the very back car on the train.
Right.
And you'll see it's a little bit taller than the cook car. And that is either a passenger or a box car that probably was converted into a bunk car for the crew, the railroad crew. And that could hold 20 men in short, just simply wooden bunks. So that is primarily the detailed description I can offer here. This is definitely a head of track work train. Somewhere in the prairies, probably, like I say, between probably the early 1870s to the early 1880s. That locomotive was used by the railroad during that period of time.
Okay.
So that's what it is. And of course, on every instance, we work very hard to remind people to not use this photograph because it is just simply is not related to the Orphan Train saga.
Right. Right. And we do the same here.
Yeah.
now that we know better.
Yeah, well, I mean that's again, that's kind of the fun of doing all this. And there are some wonderful photographs out there that can be substituted in for this one.
Yes, and we have one of those, and I want to talk about that. Okay, so this image is the one that we have in our collection that we have been able to say with almost complete certainty that this is an orphan train. So I wanted to talk about some of the differences that we see here. As you mentioned, people kind of have this misconception that orphan trains were a whole train full of orphans. Some people think they traveled in box cars, those sorts of the myth that's out there. That's the myth.
Right,
But like you said, we know that these children were traveling on regularly scheduled passenger trains, and that's what we see here. They also weren't traveling in these huge groups usually. We
right.
know that the Foundling Hospital, the New York Foundling Hospital, did take larger groups. The largest I've heard of is like maybe 75 kids. But that would have been a very large group. More often we see groups of anywhere from 5 kids to about 50. So that not enough to fill a whole train just by
No,
themselves.
and only enough to fill one car. So what would happen with
Right.
in both instances, but let's talk about the Children's Aid Society. The New York Foundling Hospital did exactly the same thing. So they would lease a car from a private car from the Erie Railroad, which was attached to a regularly scheduled passenger train. And that car would go to Chicago, and there it would be the train terminated because New York Central and the Erie terminated their western terminal was Chicago. Um, so let's say then these children are going to somewhere in Nebraska. So the car would be shunted onto a passenger train on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe that was going to that community. In the car, children would not get out of the car. They didn't have to do that. They didn't change trains. The trains changed for them. And then they would arrive in the community or communities along a branch line where they were going. Um, and then when the deeds were done, the car was returned to Chicago by the Santa Fe to the Erie, because every day that this car then was not on the Erie system, but was on the Santa Fe system, the Erie charged the Santa Fe so many dollars a day for
Gotcha.
its lease use. So the Santa Fe wanted to get rid of this car as soon as they could because they didn't want to keep paying rent on it.
Right.
Some railroads, yeah. Well, in some railroads, like the Pennsylvania into St. Louis, um, if children were going on and it was a private car attached to a Penn train, that was as far as the car went. The Pennsylvania Railroad refused to do interconnections with other railroads.
Mhm.
The other thing that's really important about this picture, Kelly, is the car in the back here is a passenger car, and that's certainly true. I think, though, if you look at the car in front of it, it's a box car.
Mm.
So what happened in many, many, many small communities around America, yes, as we saw in the previous photograph, the train came to town, the railroad came to town. So there was passenger service pretty much at least 5 days a week, quite often 7 days a week.
Mhm.
But those trains, especially in smaller communities, were called mixed trains. They would have both passenger and freight cars on
Gotcha.
them because the town or the community or communities along the branch line weren't large enough to support a separate um, passenger train from a separate freight train.
Right.
So they would create mixed, and they were called mixed trains, where there was both. Where I grew up, um, one of the towns is very small, and this dates me, but we had the same thing. We had actually two passenger trains a day, but they were mixed trains. Freight was going to where Polaris Snowmobiles manufactures their snowmobiles. It was 10 miles away from where I grew up. So that's something to keep in mind. Just because there's a box car in front of this passenger car doesn't invalidate it at all.
Right.
In fact, I can tell you that this train arrived in a very small community, even given the large number of people there. Um, and this one is is very well documented as to what it is.
Yes, and we have a whole nother video about this photograph and how we discovered that it was an orphan train and kind of how we went about researching it. And I will put the link to that video in this video's description, and then I'll put a little link off to the side so that people can click on it and learn more about this.
Okay.
But that is great analysis. And like you said, yeah, there's a lot of people here, but we know this is Blue Rapids, Kansas, which is still a pretty small town today. So yeah, what you're saying makes perfect sense to me, knowing that Blue Rapids is a small community, that they wouldn't have gotten, full trains that were just passenger cars, because not that many people were traveling to Blue Rapids, Kansas in 1908.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting, in some respects, the smaller the town, the bigger the crowd that would show up for an event like this.
Right, because it was a big deal.
It was, absolutely. Yep.
Yes.
So yeah, this is a great photo.
Well, we have about 4.5 minutes left on this meeting. Is there anything else that you want to make sure you mention about this photograph or about the other one?
No, I think the contrast between the two is important in that this one, the history and of it, where it came from, is spot on. And consider the caption and the information known about this photograph with the other, where a simple line where someone at the Kansas Historical Society wrote, "This may be an orphan train." Never said it was. And just because the image is so nice, people jumped onto it. Everyone made an assumption about what this is, just like people make an assumption about the notion that there were orphan trains that crisscrossed the country. So it's very important to be factual and not let your emotions run away with your brain, as they say.
Right. And this image we can back up with newspaper articles documenting the event, documenting this arrival. We can even pick out some of the people who are standing on the back of that train. We are able to say, oh, we know exactly who this person is based on other things in our collection. So yeah, this one has lots of other documents that back up the statements that have been made about this image. And this one, we've only discovered this in the last couple of years. This was donated to us here at the museum. So there's not a ton. It doesn't seem like there's a ton of verified orphan train images, but I know there's probably more out there. We just have to find them. Thank you so much, John, for
You're most welcome.
Doing this call and educating me about what you do and these great images.
Well, like you like to say, it's great fun. It's very rewarding for all of us. We do not charge for our time, etc. So, and thank you for allowing us to work through the National Museum and letting people reach out to us and warm our hearts. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much, John.